State-funded terrorism is a term that seems to arise after the attacks on 9/11, but it's far older than that. Throughout time, states have funded paramilitary organizations inside their enemies' borders, but there are very few instances of state-supported terrorism inside their own borders. But this is precisely what happens in the 1940s Denmark. To set the stage, on April the 9th, 1940, Nazi troops crossed the Danish border. What follows was a fighting retreat by the Danish military, while the politicians came to agreement with their Nazi counterparts. An agreement was made where Denmark continued to exist as an independent country with its own political and legal institutions. This meant that the Danish parliament and police force continued to serve without much Nazi interference. This made Denmark a safe haven for Jews, as Denmark didn't pass any laws even after multiple requests by the Nazis. Even though it was not perfect, the Nazis liked the agreement. They thought it was temporary, and Denmark, a Nordic, Aryan country, would quickly turn and integrate into the Third Reich. But they were wrong. A resistance movement quickly sprung up, and did everything from delaying work on Nazi jobs to blowing up ammunition factories. However, there was not much the Nazis could do about it. The Danish parliament did little to tighten laws, and the Danish police seems much worse at solving crimes when the victims were Nazis. Gestapo, the secret Nazi police, did open several offices in Denmark, but they found limited success at hunting down the resistance, especially since they had to work under and around Danish laws. In 1943, the situation boiled over. Germany was having problems in both Russia and Africa, and in Denmark the resistance saw popular support, so much so that workers called a general strike. This strike saw workers protesting in the streets over the worsening economic situation brought on by the war. In response, the Nazis demanded stricter laws, curfews, and the death penalty reinstated. The Danish parliament would not allow the death penalty to be reinstated, and so dissolved parliament until the Nazis would bring more reasonable demands. But instead, on the 30th of August 1943, one day after the parliament was dissolved, Nazi forces formed a new government, while Nazi troops arrested Danish police officers and took their jobs. But even with complete control of the government and police force, the Danish resistance were hard to deal with. So, at the end of 1943, the Danish SS command decided to form a counter-terrorism group, the Petersgruppen, or in English, Peters Group. The group was named after the first commander, Otto Schwerdt's Danish cover name Peter Safen, but their job was not to kill the terrorists, but instead to fight back with even more terror. SS Standardoberführer Otto Baunspeer described their role as fighting terror with terror, and so started the Nazi-funded terror campaign against Nazi-controlled Denmark. In the beginning, the group was entirely composed of veteran SS troops. However, it was quickly realized to be insufficient if the group wanted to launch similar numbers of attack as the Danish resistance. The group began to search for suitable Danish members. These were found mainly in the Schaltenburg Corps, an SS-operated paramilitary group designed to recruit Danish citizens into the Nazi military and SS groups. However, the Schaltenburg Corps was not a Nazi success story, with few Danes willing to join, and its role questioned and changed by internal power struggles of the Nazi regime. However, it did give Petersgruppen many of its Danish members, Danes that were so in love with the Nazi idea that they were willing to bomb civilians for them. In the beginning, targets were carefully selected. Most of the group's early work was focused on places of joy. Several amusement parks, theaters, and cinemas were bombed. The Danish public boycotted cinemas showing Nazi-produced movies. Petersgruppen responded by bombing and burning several Danish movie studios. The Danish press was also targeted, and several newspaper houses was bombed. This, however, did not stop the support for the Danish resistance as the Nazis had hoped. Instead, it generated stronger hate towards the Nazi occupiers. In the fall of 1944, frustrated with the lack of effect the action had, the Petersgruppen began more directly targeting civilians. The best example of this might be the train bombings. One attack in October 1944 saw 20 dead, and on the 31st of March, 2 trains were bombed on the same evening. However, it was late in the evening, and the few passengers on board all escaped alive. Another example would be the bombing of Guldsmedegade on the 22nd of February 1945. Around 10 phosphorus firebombs exploded in one of Aarhus shopping streets. The bombs were timed to explode one after another, seemingly to stretch and overwhelm the rescue personnel. Several buildings on the street collapsed or were so damaged that they had to be torn down. At the same time, as the group began targeting civilians more directly, it also began conducting assassinations on prominent Danes. The first of these killings was on Kai Munk, a Danish priest, author and poet. He was taken from his home and shot on a roadside outside Silkeborg. In Odense, multiple doctors suspected of helping the resistance was murdered. And in Aarhus, the newspaper editor Bjørn Schmidt was gunned down in his own bed. In many ways, these attacks were meant to look like the Danish resistance carried them out. Petersgruppen used British and US weapons captured from the resistance. However, it was not hard for the Danish public to see through it. The targets was very different. The resistance mainly focused on military and logistic targets, while Petersgruppen targeted civilians on the street and in their homes. It did not help that no one was ever arrested or charged in the Petersgruppen's attacks, and even some in the SS command wanted it known, so they forced newspapers to run stories of resistance activities next to stories of Petersgruppen's attacks. This clear difference, and the fact that many known members of Schaltenburg Korpset were spotted around the attacks, caused the Danes to call these attacks Schalbutage, and the murders became known as clearingsmord, or in English, clearingsmurders. Petersgruppen was not the only such group that existed. At least 5 other groups existed, all formed by different Nazi organizations. However, Petersgruppen stood out by the amount and deadliness of their attack. They operated throughout Denmark, but was especially active in the major cities but were easy to target civilians. In total, Petersgruppen was responsible for the death of 160 people, 25 murder attempts, 8 train bombings, and 157 bombings of buildings. It all created damages for more than 100 million kroners. On top of this, many more were wounded, and all of this was done by Nazis inside Nazi-controlled Denmark. Throughout the war, the Danish resistance killed several group members, and some of the SS members were sent and killed on the front lines. Those left at the end of the war tried to hide or escape Denmark. However, most were captured by the Danish resistance in the days following the Nazi surrender. All remaining members were put on trial. The German members were tried separately from the Danish members, and escaped relatively easy with prison sentences up to life in prison. However, the Danish members were hit much harder. 7 of them were given the death penalty and killed by firing squad. This was ironic, as it had been the Nazis that reinstated the death penalty in Denmark, largely to punish resistance fighters. However, after the war, the Danish government decided to retain it until 1950, so it could be used to punish war criminals.